The final part of the brainstem to cover is the medulla. So starting off, we'll talk about, once again, external features, internal features, and blood supply. So external features first of all, we have the ventral surface, and the major features in the ventral surface is either side of the midline. We've got the elevations of the medullary pyramids. Lateral to these elevations, we've got larger oval elevations which form the inferior olives. Now, that's pretty much the major important features. Lateral to the inferior olives, you've got the inferior cerebellar peduncles as well. On the dorsal, turning our attention to the dorsal surface now, as you can see, there is a part which forms the lower part of the fourth ventricle, which is this part here, and there is a part below which doesn't form part of the fourth ventricle. But the first thing that we should note is that we see the inferior cerebellar peduncle attaching to the back of the pontomedullary junction. Well, as we said before, there's a part which forms the floor of the fourth ventricle, and there's a part below that, and the part below that is has two main elevations on it. The lateral of these elevations is a cuneate nucleus, which is the termination of the cuneate tract from the which is a dorsal column tract in the spinal cord, which we'll talk about later. It basically carries tactile and vibration sense from the ipsilateral half of the body. And medial to the cuneate nucleus, we've got the gracile nucleus. In the floor of the fourth ventricle, we have the hypoglossal trigone, which lies medial to the vagal trigone. And lateral to the vagal trigone, we've got the vestibular area, which lies here, which I haven't labelled. Anyway, so the next thing that we've got and we need to consider with the external features is the attached cranial nerves. The first thing that we have to note, so there's two sets of cranial nerves. One of these emerges between the olives and the medullary pyramids, and this is cranial nerve 12 fibers. And the second set of fibers emerges between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle behind it. And this consists of, from above to below, the rootlets of cranial nerves 9, 10, and 11. We can also see on this diagram, arising from the upper part of the spinal cord, the spinal part of the accessory nerve. Moving on now to the internal features of the medulla. Now, the important thing about the internal features is we need to consider once again the tectum, the tegmentum, and the ventral part. The ventral part of the medulla in both, so this is the lower medulla and this is the upper medulla. The ventral part of the medulla in both parts is formed by the medullary pyramids. If we now turn our attention to the tectum in the upper part of the medulla is not really existent. It basically corresponds to the inferior medullary velum, which lies behind the lower part of the fourth ventricle. In the lower part of the medulla, the fourth ventricle has condensed to form the central canal of the spinal cord, which will now pass through the spinal cord downwards. And the tegmentum has the gracile and cuneate nuclei. So the tectum contains the gracile and cuneate nuclei behind the behind the central canal. The next thing to consider would be the tegmentum. The tegmentum consists of nuclei. It consists of ascending and it consists of nuclei and also ascending and interconnecting tracts. Starting off with the nuclei, the first set of nuclei that we have are cranial nerve nuclei, and the cranial nerve nuclei, we'll consider them in the upper medulla first, and then see them in the lower medulla as well. The cranial nerve nuclei, from medial to lateral, we have the somatic column, which here is represented by the cranial nerve 12 or hypoglossal nucleus. Lateral to this, and on a slightly anterior plane, we have the nucleus ambiguus, which connects to cranial nerves 9 and 10 for supply of muscles of the pharynx and larynx. lateral to the nucleus ambiguus, but lying in the floor of the fourth ventricle, we have the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus nerve. Now, the vagal trigone and the hypoglossal trigone are produced by the impressions of the vagal and hypoglossal nuclei, respectively. Lateral to these columns, we have the sensory columns. Now, the sensory columns, from medial to lateral, we have firstly the nucleus tractus solitarius, which is the visceral afferent column. Lateral to the visceral afferent column, we've got the special somatic afferent column, and that consists of the vestibular nuclei. And finally, we have furthest laterally the general somatic afferent column, which is formed by the spinal trigeminal nucleus. And this observes sensation of pain and temperature from the ipsilateral face. In the lower part of the medulla, these nuclei are also present and are positioned roughly in the same relative positions. The only difference is that the nucleus ambiguus and the vestibular nuclei are no longer present at these levels. So from medial to lateral, we've got cranial nerves 12 and 10, so the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus and the hypoglossal nucleus. Lateral to this, we've got the visceral afferent column, which is formed by the nucleus tractus solitarius, and finally, furthest laterally, we have the spinal trigeminal nucleus, which connects to the trigeminal nerve. The next thing that we need to consider with the tegmentum is ascending tracts. The major tracts are the medial lemniscus. The other nucleus that we need to consider before we move on to the tracts is the inferior illyrian nuclei, and basically they're very characteristically shaped, and they lie behind and lateral to the medullary pyramids. The next thing that we need to consider is the ascending tracts. The first ascending tract is the medial lemniscus. Now, the medial lemniscus lies either side of the midline, immediately behind the medullary pyramids, in the upper medullary section. In the lower medullary section, they're in the process of being formed, and the area here is referred to as the internal arcuate fasciculus, and the label will come up later and I'll point it out then. The other ascending tract that you have is the spinothalamic tract, which lies just behind the inferior illyrian nuclei, and it lies quite far laterally and separated from the medial lemniscus. If we have a look at it in the lower section of the medulla now, once again, as I said before, the medial lemniscus has not completely formed and is at this stage known as the internal arcuate fasciculus. So basically, fibers are crossing over from the opposite gracile nucleus to the opposite medial lemniscus at this stage. And once again, we've got the spinothalamic tract, which lies quite far laterally. In addition, in the lower part of the medulla, we have the spinocerebellar tract as well, which lies laterally and passes into the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The interconnecting tracts now, if we talk about the interconnecting tracts, are represented by the medial longitudinal fasciculus, which lies immediately either side of the midline in the dorsal part of the medulla. We'll now talk about the blood supply and the clinical importance of remembering where all the important structures are. Now, starting off now, the important thing to understand with the medulla is that there is a medial zone and there is a lateral zone to blood supply. The medial zone is in between these two lines, and the lateral zone is located lateral to this. In the medial zone, the main structures that get damaged include the medullary pyramids, the medial lemniscus, and the hypoglossal nuclei. The effects of this kind of lesion is that you'll get a contralateral hemiplegia, because the medullary pyramids control the motor control for the contralateral side of the body, and they actually cross in the medullary decussation. You get a contralateral hemianesthesia, and that's due to lesion of the medial lemniscus. And the medial lemniscus fibers have already crossed over from the opposite gracile nucleus by this stage. and you get an MLF lesion. At this level, it doesn't really cause major symptomatic features, and the hypoglossal lesion will cause ipsilateral weakness of tongue muscles. In the lateral zone, the major structures to get affected that cause symptoms include the vestibular nuclei, the nucleus ambiguus, and the spinal trigeminal nucleus. And finally, in terms of the tracts, the other thing that gets damaged in lateral medullary problems is the spinothalamic and spinocerebellar tracts. Now, the problems that arise here are when cranial nerve 8 gets damaged, you get problems in equilibrium or maintaining balance. Problems with problems with the nucleus ambiguus cause difficulty swallowing because of paralysis of the pharyngeal and laryngeal muscles. Lesion of the cranial nerve 5 nucleus will cause ipsilateral loss of pain and temperature sensation from the face, and lesion of the spinothalamic tract will cause loss of contralateral pain and temperature sensation from the body. And this is because the spinothalamic tract has already crossed its fibers in the spinal cord below. The final thing for the medulla, the final thing that gets damaged in lateral lesions of the medulla are the spinocerebellar tracts, and this causes cerebellar ataxia when it's damaged. So the person basically has incoordination and walks with a wide-based gait. Now, in terms of what arteries supply which, I forgot to mention this earlier, the medial zone is supplied by branches of the anterior spinal as well as the vertebral arteries, and the lateral zone is supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. In case you weren't paying attention or you just wanted a simple summary of the brainstem, a really easy summary of the brainstem is provided by the brainstem rules of 4, and this is pretty much all you need to know in a clinic. The first thing that you need to know are there are 4 rules. The first of these rules are that there are 4 nerves arising above the midbrain, above the pons, there's 4 at the pons, and there's 4 cranial nerves arising from the medulla. The second thing that you need to know are that all motor nuclei are divisible into 12. So, cranial nerves 3, 4, 6, and 12 all mainly form the motor nuclei. The next thing that you need to know is that all the midline structures in the brainstem, so the ones that are affected by medial vascular lesions, all start with M. Important midline structures include motor nuclei, motor tracts, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and the medial lemniscus. Sorry, I didn't remember it in the right order. Lesions of the motor nuclei will cause isolated cranial nerve lesions. Lesions of the motor tract will cause a contralateral hemiplegia. Lesions of the medial lemniscus will lead to loss of tactile and vibration sense from the opposite side of the body, and lesions of the medial longitudinal fasciculus will cause problems in coordination in lateral gaze. The next thing is that all the lateral structures start with S. This is the final rule, and basically lying in the lateral part of the brainstem affected by lateral vascular syndromes, we have the the sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve, we have the spinocerebellar tracts, we have the spinothalamic tracts, and we have the sympathetic pathways as well. Loss of the spinocerebellar tracts will cause cerebellar ataxia and incoordination. Loss of sensory nucleus of cranial nerve 5 will cause loss of pain and temperature sensation as well as general sensation from the ipsilateral face. Loss of the spinothalamic tracts leads to loss of pain and temperature sensation from the contralateral side of the body. Remember, the tracts have already crossed for the spinothalamic tracts at the level of the spinal cord. And finally, we have the sympathetic pathway. So you get an ipsilateral Horner's syndrome with a lateral brainstem lesion.